Okay, our next speaker is Kimberly Alexander. She has a PhD in art history from Boston University and is on the faculty in the history department at the University of New Hampshire, where she is director of museum studies and lecturer. She has held curatorial positions at several New England museums, including the MIT Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, and Strawberry Bank.
Yeah, Strawberry Bank.
Okay. She's the author of Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era, which received a historic New England Honor Award, and Fashioning the New England Family. She was also a guest curator of Fashioning the New England Family at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Please welcome Dr. Alexander.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic on working? Okay, great. As you can probably tell from my background, this will be a little bit different talk than the ones you've been hearing so far. I want to first of all thank Steve and Melissa for organizing this conference and for inviting me and just for such impeccable organizing skills. When I was first asked to give this talk, I immediately thought of it as a learning opportunity. I did not imagine that I would get so ensnared in the primary resources and the inventories that I went down so many dozens of rabbit holes looking for more information. But I did look at it as a learning opportunity. I've spent years, actually probably decades at this point, combing through probate inventories, diaries, day books, account books, and letters throughout New England. With this invitation, I recognized an opportunity to connect with the history of those who inhabited a region that I was not terribly familiar with, through the lens of their everyday lives and their belongings. And thanks to Steve and to Kirsten, who a wonderful segue for this talk, I was given access, I was given access to a handful of probate inventories from individuals from a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds, and my appreciation to her specifically for these illuminating translations. In the words of noted historian Marcus Rediker, what I'm going to talk to you about today is going to be more of a history from below. In other words, an examination of the importance of world of goods from everyday people whose inventories have been preserved, and believe me, there are far fewer of those than those from the upper echelons, with a less focus on those more well-known. As my interest is in material culture, I'll be bringing in examples of items similar to those found in the inventories. Inventories, quite simply, for me at least, can provide a lens into life at home rather than the public outward display of one's life, which can be, as we all know, changed and manipulated in a variety of different fashions. I'm going to talk about the inventory of Fernando Lebea and his wife Maria, the founder of St. Louis, Pierre Leclerc, stonemason, just very briefly, Amable Guillon, and free African-American Jeanette Forchette. It soon became clear to me that there was far more fascinating materials in these inventories than I could ever cover in a 45-minute talk. Today's presentation analyzes this diverse cross-section of several of these inventories and gives us a glimpse of people's lives through their possessions. The inventories, probate and marriage contracts, census records also underscore the diversity of the Atlantic world as this Revolutionary War unfolds. And we know, of course, that there's a very diverse population mix, Americans, free and enslaved, blacks, British, French, Native Americans, and Spanish people all involved. I'm interested in these patterns and the items which are shared across these different backgrounds. And it's also important to remember, I think, as we've discussed throughout this conference, how did everyday people respond to conditions of war? When you have, during times of war, those who remain at home, or the women who follow their husbands, are also experiencing a world turned upside down, a world where things are not always certain, where things can disappear or be lost forever, whether they be your loved ones, your possessions, and so on. It's a world of insecurity, of food, of work, of family. I also want to say a note about the use of inventories, because I think this is important. This is not in any way an exact science. Inventories frequently depend on the situation. Was the inventory being taken at the time of one's death? Was the inventory being taken at the time of one's marriage? Was it being taken because somebody was in debt and had debts to be paid off? Frequently, as one aged, valuable or useful items were given to children so they could be used, or neighbors or friends to whom you felt close to, or when a son or daughter married. Sometimes the person assessing the materials wouldn't mention certain items because they were deemed as insignificant. We find that with a number of items related particularly to women's inventories being taken by male executors. Or perhaps they were items that were destined to be sent along to other family members, as I'll discuss in a bit. The reason for the inventory, as I say, marriage, debt, decease, or died intestate, can all change the function of an inventory. Today I'm going to start with the inventory of Jeanette Frechette. And these are the actual pages of the inventory, which was, I want to again thank Kristen for her painstaking translation of this for me. Jeanette Frechette, this is taken about 1790, and she is labeled in the beginning of her inventory as a free negress. She's introduced to us in this account around the time of her second husband's death in 1790. She would die in 1803, and although she would not, of course, know it at the time, her descendants, she would actually become, through the parcel of land she received from Laclede and through her various marriages, she would become the matriarch of one of St. Louis's most successful black families. Her granddaughter, I believe it was, married into the Labadie family. She was enslaved and then free, and was ultimately, as I mentioned, given land in St. Louis by Laclede. Her house lot measured similar to those of others. 25 feet long was her house by 20 feet wide. The inventory also mentions that there was an orchard and a garden and an extra plot of land as well. We get to see a chance to feel something of her full life through this inventory, and I'm showing here the translation from Christine with some areas highlighted. If you go down, you have everyday items, but notice also the notations: old, good ones, bad ones. Condition can be relative, but if you're doing this constantly, looking at inventories, then that's something that you are making a judgment about. And given what we know about Jeanette Frechette, is I think seems in keeping with her life. I want to take a look at the very bottom, 6 plates, ditto, in bad condition. We also above have 7 chairs, good ones and bad ones. One of the things that we know through the inventory and through the little scraps of her life that we've been able to pull together is that, like so many families in and around St. Louis and the region, just as I find in New England, is that people diversify to an incredible extent. You may have a trade that you had a skill in. Her first husband was in fact a blacksmith. And her second husband, who was known as Valentin, was a gunsmith. They were both free black men as well. She most likely took in washing as a way of augmenting the family income. And you can see that here, 3 pairs of irons for ironing linens. This was going to be a job that needed to be done. And if you go down further, you'll see that she also had buckets and a barrel, all which would be attributed, possibly used for laundry and for ironing. But we also get a sense in this inventory of the things that she had come into her possession from the deaths of her husband, which would carry some value on the market. A medium-sized anvil, a double-headed anvil in bad condition, from her first husband, the blacksmith. And then we see 37 old gun barrels in the inventory. Well, recall her second husband, Valentin, was a gunsmith. Perhaps these were pieces that he was stockpiling, so to speak, for future repair and use. Or in the case of the box of scrap metal, perhaps we're looking at something that either was going to be used by either the first or the second husband. But the point is that she's retained these domestic goods despite their condition. A medium-sized vat, et cetera, et cetera. And then down below, you also get a sense of the homesteading aspect. We know from her inventory that she had land, and she had an orchard and a garden. We also find here that she had 20 hens, 2 roosters. She had a cart with broken wheels, a pair of oxen, about 8 years old, a cow and a 1-year-old calf, the cow 4 years old, and then a cow about 3 years old. So you would have been able to provide eggs, milk, and occasional sort of domestic goods for yourself or your family with this somewhat limited livestock. Late in my research for this, I came across the fabulous watercolors and silhouettes of Anna Maria von Pfuhl, who documented the lives of those of everyday people in St. Louis in a way that is very hard to find. And she comes to St. Louis from Kentucky region, and she never considered herself an artist. And I'm showing you here on the screen, it's actually a photograph of a painting of her at work with a large folio. In fact, there is a folio that survives at the St. Louis, at the Missouri Historical Society. And I believe there was recently an exhibition, or maybe not so recently, of some of her watercolors. And I'm showing you on the opposite screen some of the typical sort of French or Creole dress with the head wrap, the neckerchief, the long sleeve shirt, and work skirt that would have been very common in St. Louis and probably for a woman like Jeanette Frechette. We have Atlantic world paintings. These are from Dominica, from the West Indies, the 2 on either side by Antonio Bernias. But I call your attention particularly to the elaborate headscarves and head wraps, and particularly to the striped jackets or casacans, short jackets that are sort of the everyday wear of women throughout the region. And the center portrait dates about 1837, so it's later, but the sitter showing again the elaborate sort of a combination cap and head wrap. Another one of the watercolors here, a mother with child and probably a young teenage boy, showing the fashions of the time that you would have found by, again, everyday people. The mother wearing a sort of transitional gown from the post-revolution, sort of 1790s, and the bonnet holding the child. And the young man here wearing a hat that looks a bit oversized for his head. Perhaps most likely a beaver skin or beaver fur hat. He's wearing the shorter waistcoat that we associate in the post-revolutionary war era, as well as the shorter coat and the long trousers. I'd like to, as I mentioned, I just wanted to finish up. So with Frechette, she was one of a very small number of free blacks in colonial St. Louis. She was able to retain her personal freedom and had rights that were denied to those who were enslaved. Under French and Spanish law, for example, she could own property, she could marry, and she could enter into contracts. However, she still had to obey certain social and legal restrictions that were in place at the time. For example, if she was going to leave St. Louis, she had to let town officials know. And she, despite being twice widowed, was never given what was the honorific title of widow at that time. I'd like to compare her life with a woman who I've done some work on in Boston, Chloe Spears. Chloe Spears' time frame almost exactly mirrors that of Jeanette. And she was also once enslaved and then freed. And Chloe Spears' inventory is very short, as you can see on the screen in front of you. She also witnessed the happenings of the American Revolution from Boston, so I guess you would say she had a front row seat, whether she wanted that or not. She learned to read despite the threats of her enslaver that he would have her hung by her thumbs if she continued that practice. But she continued to learn to read, and she was eventually manumitted, and she married a man named Caesar, who was also a free black Bostonian. And what she acquired is really quite impressive. Although her inventory is short, she had several luxury goods, including an ebony tea table, a mirror, and some pictures. She and her husband ran a boarding house in downtown Boston. So a number of the items that we see in this inventory are for cooking, because if you were doing room and board, you provided food, at least a breakfast meal and often other meals for your boarders. And we see a number of items related to that. But she became part of one of the strong churches in Boston. So she was born in Africa, she was enslaved in Boston, she was freed, she became a member of the church, and she gave away hundreds of dollars to black Bostonians upon her death, all women who were members of her church. So even these, and I've gone through, and there were bequests of as much as between $10 and $50, which would have been certainly enough for many women to make considerable do with at some time. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned at the beginning, was how do we look at items across the socioeconomic spectrum? And this is a partial inventory for Senora de la Be's clothing. And we have this because, to tie in with Kristen's talk, the daughters were sent a number of their mother's belongings, which would make sense. So, and so we have a petticoat, several petticoats. I'm not going to read them all to you. We've got, let's see, like 6 petticoats of different types, cloth, muslin, polonaise with a burn hole. Now, this is somebody who's really looking very carefully at this inventory, aren't they? A petticoat with a gown of green taffeta with a llamas petticoat. We're not quite sure what that means. It may be a softer sort of like a llama or Angora type of fur with its gown of satin. And then down below you see the jackets again, the casquins that we saw very informally on some of the women of color earlier. A seersucker jacket, batiste, striped muslin, and so on. And I'm showing you here an image from, again, there was an exhibition that just finished in January, I gather, that I actually tried to get here for, that was from the Royal Ontario Museum and was at the museum here, which looked at a world of chintz and Indian fabrics, which you see constantly in the inventories, whether they're full garments or whether they're fragments. And here I'm showing you a beautiful back of one of these matched jackets, probably not unlike something that she would have owned and worn, given the descriptions that we have. Also on view in this exhibition is this wonderful gown. It's actually I believe it's a sack back, has a long flowing piece of drapery down the back. But look at all the fabric that went into securing a dress like this. You had an under petticoat, then the overcoat, and these are the types of garments that are described in her inventory. Additionally, there were 2 pairs of pockets. Now, I don't have anything as outstanding as Steve's regalia yesterday on a mannequin, but I did bring a sample pocket that was made by a friend of mine. This was an important item of women's clothing really throughout the 18th century, and it would have been tied to your waist. Actually, I should have had one of our wonderful costumed interpreters come up, but you would have had this tied to your waist under your petticoat, which would have had a slit for your hand. So it would go in like this, right? So you could keep your valuable items. A pocket, whether you were of a highborn life or lowborn, was incredibly important for women. If you were a servant in a household, it might be where you kept a paper that gave a recommendation for you. It might be where you kept a crumb of bread. DNA tests and a value and fiber tests going on inside pockets. There's a wonderful book just on pockets. So believe me, I'm not the only one who's obsessed with this idea. We found bits of cheese and old bread. Things like that that you would stow away in your pocket if you were somebody who was working in a household. If you were a wealthy individual, you might carry the keys to the house. You might carry a very fancy sewing kit with a silver thimble, any number of different items. But that old poem that you've heard, Lucy Lockett Lost Her Pocket, well, we find numerous advertisements in colonial newspapers, again, throughout the country, where people have lost their pockets. And sometimes, if you were someone who was living on the edge, that could mean the difference between survival and the poorhouse, right? And they were not always easy to abscond with, but sometimes working women would wear their pocket on the outside just as a convenience or for whatever reason. It was very easy, as you can imagine, for them to come untied or for somebody to actually snip the threads. And so the records on pockets is really quite extensive. So, and this is also done in a reproduction fabric of the Indian style, Indians. So pockets, we have 3 pairs of pockets. That's an incredible, if they're pairs, so that means you've got 6. So you've got 2, 3, 1 on each side. Some women could only afford 1 pocket, right? So she's got 3 pockets, pairs of pockets, and then 2 pockets of linen. So she can, like picking a purse or a wallet or your necktie today, right? She's got lots of different options. Round bonnets, gauze with stripes, mantillas, sort of to cover your shoulders or to close up the front of your dress, and so on and so on. Silk stockings used 1 pair. Again, this is a very careful inventory. Now, this is, we translated it as 2 hairnets, linen, of linen thread, de hilo thread. And I think that is probably more of the headscarf, the head wrap, which was a common, both in terms of piety and religion and public display, was an important part of a woman's wardrobe. Again, no matter what part of the socioeconomic strata they were into. So women were, the comparisons across different economic levels, you're going to have petticoats, pockets, head coverings, sewing cases, and the one that gets most attention probably from many people are what we call stays. More recently, generations will call them corsets, but the stays or bodices, this is a wonderful example, and this is here at the Missouri Historical Society. But these are not the most expensive examples that you would find. Stays could be incredibly expensive. They could be, for the wealthy, they were often covered with silk or silk brocade. These are canvas that are stiffened with paste, as opposed to having probably a London or a stay maker who did nothing but make these garments. And just, I could give you a whole lecture on myth busting about the importance of stays versus corsets and so on, because we've all been led to believe that these, the tight lacing and so on and so on. But in fact, the whole idea with the stays was simply to present whatever the stylish feature was. It was not about creating a thin silhouette. We have Scarlett O'Hara to thank for that. But the idea was that it would hold your posture upright and guide the elements of your clothing. Unless you think that this was just for women, we have examples of men's stays as well. The idea of what was often considered deceit in both men and women, we often get some very interesting satires on men wearing stays. And I'll also let you know that at my time at Strawberry Bank, I've found 2 examples of men's waistcoats that were padded in the chest, right? So we don't always see, we're not always seeing what we think we see, even in those days. So whether you were a fashionista with an extensive wardrobe, or whether you were a more modest early Republican sitter, you can find all of these examples here locally. Here I'm showing you a portrait of Madame Leclerc with an Indian dress fragment from about 1750. And I want to say something quickly about the use of red for those of you who may or may not know, but the ability to come up with a really rich red was very expensive. It relied on something called cochineal, which was based on a small South American beetle that had to be dried, crushed, and so on. And so this was a very labor-intensive process, and it was a very expensive dye. So you might look at this at first as just this scrap of fabric, but in fact, this was an expensive scrap of fabric. And it was kept by descendants and eventually made into what is known as a little pocketbook or wallet. I was not able to get pictures of how it opens. But, and the yellow ribbon. Yellow was also a very, very hard color to work with. All these natural-based dyes, anything pretty much before 1850 or 1830 is going to be a natural dye, and so they tend to go fugitive. Their colors are not necessarily fast. So this is a wonderful fragment that was saved and then transformed into a new object. This is not an uncommon occurrence for a way of remembering our ancestors. This is an example of one of Martha Washington's sewing cases. And it's made from fragments of her dress, not unlike the example I just showed you. And this is from Colonial Williamsburg. And you can see here, you've got at least 4 different patterns that have been cut down to make this new item. Textiles were expensive, labor was cheap. You held on to what you could. Even the wealthy would hold on to their clothes and have them repaired and refurbished and renewed, even re-dyed. We have a portrait here. This is a later portrait of Marguerite Blondeau-Guillon. And you all know her history, I'm sure, much better than I ever could. The amiable Guillon's son's house here in an image. And I wanted to talk briefly about Guillon because much of his inventory as a stonemason is given over to the trade, over to his trade and his business. He had a number of items in his inventory that are not related to his trade, including a small feather bed that was covered with hides and fur. He had old torn blankets, all used, small bunk beds, and then he had some high-end goods as well. His inventory is a real mix of different types of items and quality of items. And he provides for me with the, I'll skip here, with a perfect segue into talking about the world of pelts, furs, and skins. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Caleb Bingham's painting, which is much later in the 19th century of fur traders. But I think it still captures a sense, certainly, of nostalgia, an East Coast nostalgia for life in the West. And you all will know this guy. I always have to find a way to bring Ben Franklin in his fur cap, right? So, but it's interesting, the connections with this. It's been assumed that the fur for his cap came from Canada. It's probably beaver fur, although others have some weighed in on other theories. But this was first engraved for his visit to Paris in 1777. And it was a French engraver who completed it. So it's this perfect sort of idea of this new person, this American. And I'm showing you here a still that you all would have seen last night from Steve's excellent exhibition. And here in the Fernando de la Bea part of the show. But I wanted to mention that La Bea himself has in his inventory listed 2 beaver outfits, so 2 full beaver ensembles, weighing 19 pounds, right? He also had in his inventory wig powder, shaving bowls, wig bags, and a bathtub. Now, these would all be indicators of a man of considerable success in the standard of Atlantic culture and Atlantic world at the time, no matter where he was. In the mid to late 18th century. If you look at his list of assorted textiles and the weights, that's how we know, for example, that the ensembles he had were 19 pounds, right? Here we have, if you see the pieces that the items that I've highlighted, various pieces of pelt. These are assorted textiles, so we assorted, not necessarily full runs of anything, but little bits and pieces, bits and bobs. If you're a sewing person, you might call it your stash, right? So he has various pieces of pelt. There's an embroidery canvas, and I got this a bit out of order, but here, embroidery canvas, canvas linen would have been important for things like marking samplers. And this one, which survives from about 1790 to 1810 by Clement Papin, her marking sampler. So embroidery canvas. It could also be used for embroidering uppers for shoes, which was another occupation of elite women. And then here you see silk for stays. So they've already earmarked some silk to cover stays, no doubt for Mrs. La Bea. Linen cloth for ironing. And then look at that number of table napkins. 75 table napkins, 45 of them used. Not quite sure how they constitute what means used. I mean, does that mean they hadn't been cleaned yet? I don't know. But at any rate, or were they just showing signs of wear? But this is a tremendous number of napkins. Linen was expensive. And we see numbers, much mention of linen. And I think it was interesting to talk about the development of flax, which was an important product. And in the inventory, and I'm showing you a cover for his inventory, but I wanted to call your attention here to some of the furniture items. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you see a bed canopy. Oh, and there's the wooden barrel bathtub. But then down below, the bed canopy with cotton flower curtains. That could well be one of the most valued textiles of the later, or the last quarter of the 18th century, which could have been toile. Or it could also have been, given the limited description, it could have been chintz from India. They also mention wool mattresses with gingham. which would have been another important local sort of fabric. And then, of course, you're going to get fancier, perhaps, items. Again, the ensemble, the green striped ensemble, is at the collection of the Missouri Historical Society and would have been for a man of high standing. And the waistcoat on the opposite screen, these are both 1780s to about 1800 at the latest, is from my own collection and is a silk brocaded man's waistcoat with a linen back. When English items are mentioned in the inventories, and again, you have to understand this is only a very small selection, but they are specifically noted as English. So far, at least, I've come across one notation to English textiles, and you might have had an example like this of an English waistcoat, silk cut, voided velvet, again for an upper echelon gentleman, courtesy of Colonial Williamsburg. So in this idea, I'm going to get back now to this probate inventory and the value of pelts and furs and how apparent it was for payment, trade, and barter. And this is something that you all are probably very familiar with, but in New England and New Hampshire, where I'm from, the bartered goods are a very different type. You might barter for grains and fish. One of the day books I follow, the gentleman was a shoemaker, so he's always trading shoes for work done on his house. So I found it quite fascinating to look at how extensive, and this isn't surprising given the hunting and trapping that was done throughout the region for trade and barter. And I'm showing you here, this is a translation that exists at the Missouri Historical Society for the sale of Pierre Leclade's property. But I call your attention to the last line. The purchaser shall pay the price of his purchase in deer skins or beaver skins at the prices prevalent in St. Louis during the current year ending June 1780. And so there are fixed prices for these pelts that translate into livre and so on. And so I found that fascinating as somebody from away, let's say, to be looking at. And every inventory that I looked at, with the exception of Jeanette Frichette's, had some mention of furs or pelts or skins. Even as I just showed you in Lebea's inventory, the mention of various pieces of pelt and, of course, his beaver skin outfit. The inventory, I want to go back to the inventory of Guillaume, the stonemason. His widow reports his debts, and they're all calculated by pelts. And so she has a detailed accounting that he owes so-and-so 33 livres in pelts. Someone else he owes 28 livres in pelts. Someone else 110 in pelts, and so on and so on. There's about actually about a dozen of those who are making claims, who will make claims against his estate based on this accounting system. Now, as I was working on this, I was thinking again about the types of garments, as I discussed, that a woman might wear, no matter her wealth or standing, stays, head coverings, and so on. And for men, we have the same sort of standard items. We're going to find linen shirts, waistcoats, and one of the things that is a ubiquitous item that is often taken for granted were buckskin, doeskin, or leather breeches. In my research for this talk, I found that the Missouri History Museum has acquired a rare pair of mid-18th century leather knee breeches. And they're currently undertaking a fundraising effort to conserve these. And I would like to thank the curator of textiles, Adam McFarlane, for getting back to me on a number of items that you've seen today. He's just been a terrific resource. So now they may not look like much. There they are. You can see that they definitely need to be conserved. Thank you. But initially, they would have looked something somewhat more like the image on the left, but I'm going to show you something that's much more likely. Thus far, they've not analyzed the actual skin, so they're calling this leather, whether or not it was doe skin, buckskin, or another type of skin, I do not know at this point. But notice the stitching and the details. This was a very important part of a man's wardrobe, long-wearing, flexible, and something that you would have wanted to maintain. But not everybody could make a pair of high-quality breeches. And I'm showing you here a pair of breeches from, actually from Fort Pitt, from 1770. And I imagine that the pair that I just showed you looks much more like something like this, given the time period and the use. Notice the drop front for the fly. You can see where the strings would have been in the back to adjust them. They're an incredible pair to look at. On the opposite screen is a business card, if you will, for a breeches maker in London. But you're also going to find leather breeches and glove makers in New Haven at the same time, who are starting to compete with the British artisans and merchants. And here, one of the most interesting, I think, pieces is actually a price list, showing you just, if you go down to toward the bottom, you'll see that there's, that he will fit you out with 4 pair of fine doeskin breeches for 1 year for £2 and 2 shillings. So he would take an order for the entire year that could then be sent off to the colonies or taken to your country estate, whatever that might be. He also has listed how much it would cost for buckskin for your servants, or the high-end best quality for yourself. So this is a really terrific piece to have when we look at the ubiquity of some of these items. And here, a later engraving, early 19th century engraving, but notice the couple here dancing, and the focus on the light skin, the light breeches, I imagine was to indicate that they were in fact buckskin or doeskin, but leather breeches, as well as some of the other members of the party in the background. So what have we talked about today? I think I'm showing you here some stills from the museum. Whether you had a chance to look at Steve's exhibit yesterday, or whether you have been at the St. Louis, at the Missouri History Museum, or any other of the sites, the St. Louis Art Museum also supplied a number of images for this talk. It gives you a chance to think about the exterior expression of interior lives, because the interior lives are often represented by the inventories, the paintings, the portraits. Those can be just like today's studio portraits with filters. You know, you might have the best gown or the best furniture. It may not be what you actually have at your house, but maybe you just have enough money for this portrait or for this miniature or for this watercolor. So it gives us a chance to think about, I think in a much broader way about people. And again, so this idea of what is your exterior expression of an interior life as seen through inventories. Thank you all very much. Actually, may I say something else?
Of course.
Yeah, I also forgot, I brought with me, when we were talking about the sewing kit and Martha Washington's sewing kit, this is another sort of replica of a sewing kit made from Burnley and Trowbridge, and it folds up. And this is an item that I love because not only we do think of it also as a man's item, because if you were a soldier or a sailor, it would be called a husuf, or known as a housewife, because you had to sew your own things if you didn't have someone along to help you. So you'll find these items listed as husufs or sewing kits, and as I say, I brought both of these if you want to come up and take a look. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take a 10-minute break. So please come up and look at Dr. Burns' items. Thank you.